Nestled deep in the heart of an ancient forest, the village of Whispering Pines had always been a place shrouded in mystery. Its name alone was enough to stir a sense of unease. The wind that rustled through the trees carried with it a whisper, a low, mournful sound, as though the forest itself was alive, its secrets spoken only in hushed tones. The villagers, though friendly and hardworking, carried an air of caution, a silent agreement among them that some things were better left undisturbed. The houses in Whispering Pines were simple, made of wood and stone, with thatched roofs that seemed to melt into the landscape. Moss grew thick on the sides of the buildings, and ivy climbed the walls, adding to the village's sense of age and timelessness. The streets were narrow, cobbled pathways that wound their way through the town like veins, connecting each building to the heart of the village. Its central square, where an old fountain once flowed with clear water, but now stood dry and cracked, its basin a mere shadow of what it had once been. At the edge of the village, where the forest began, there was an ancient oak tree, its twisted roots sprawling out like fingers, gripping the earth in an unbreakable hold. This tree was the oldest living thing in the village, and it was said to be the guardian of Whispering Pines, a symbol of both strength and silence. It was under this tree that the villagers would gather for special events, but these gatherings had become less frequent in recent years, replaced by whispers of strange happenings. The village seemed to be slowly fading, as if time itself was forgetting the place. The people of Whispering Pines were a quiet, reserved folk. There was little need for conversation, for everyone knew one another's business, and few strangers ever visited. It was a place untouched by the hustle and bustle of the outside world, a place that seemed to exist outside of time, but it wasn't without its oddities. No one spoke of the forest's deep, dark corners, nor of the strange lights that would flicker through the trees on certain nights. Those who had ventured too far into the woods never returned, and the villagers had long ago learned not to question the shadows that crept along the edges of their lives. The town had a rhythm, one that never seemed to change. The markets opened at dawn, selling fresh bread and vegetables, while the blacksmith hammered away at his forge. Children played in the streets, their laughter ringing through the air. But there was always a sense that something was watching, something just beyond the horizon. No one ever felt truly alone in Whispering Pines, and that was perhaps the most unsettling thing of all. But as the days passed and the seasons turned, a new presence was about to arrive in the village, a dark figure, one that would forever alter the course of Whispering Pines' quiet existence. And when he arrived, no one could have predicted the chain of events that would follow, events that would unravel the very fabric of the village, leading them all into a nightmare that none could escape. It was a crisp autumn evening when the traveling puppeteer first arrived in Whispering Pines. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves as the villagers went about their evening routines. The sky was painted with hues of crimson and amber, a fiery sunset that bled into the darkening blue of the encroaching night. The streets, usually quiet and still by this time of day, were suddenly alive with murmurs of excitement as a strange figure made his way through the village. The man was tall, his silhouette long and shadowy, draped in a cloak of midnight black that fluttered with each step. He carried with him a cart, its contents hidden under a thick tarp. His face, though pale, was sharp and chiseled, framed by the faintest hint of a beard. His eyes gleamed with an unsettling intensity, reflecting the dim light of the village like twin mirrors, cold, calculating, yet full of some unspoken promise. It was said that he had appeared out of nowhere, as if summoned by the forest itself, and there was something distinctly wrong about him. The puppeteer made his way to the heart of the village, where he set up his show. His cart, once opened, revealed a curious puppet theater, small but intricately designed. The walls of the tiny stage were covered in deep velvet curtains, embroidered with gold thread that shimmered in the fading light. On either side of the stage were racks of puppets, each one more lifelike than the last, their painted faces twisted into expressions of both joy and sorrow. The villagers who had gathered around were drawn to the theater, their curiosity piqued by the strange figure and his even stranger performance. He called to them in a voice that was both soothing and commanding, urging them to take a seat and witness the most extraordinary show they would ever see. His words were like a soft melody, but beneath the charm was an undertone of something far darker, something that chilled the bones of even the bravest villager. Despite their reservations, a few villagers, eager for entertainment, took their seats in the folding chairs that had been hastily arranged around the small stage. The rest of the townsfolk watched from a distance, their eyes narrowed in suspicion, but something in the air seemed to compel them to stay. As the first puppet took the stage, the audience fell silent. It was a marionette, but not like any they had seen before. This puppet moved with an unnatural fluidity, its wooden limbs bending in perfect synchronization, its eyes gleaming with a life that should not have been there. The performance that followed was hypnotic. Each puppet danced across the stage, their movements so lifelike that the line between them and the humans in the audience seemed to blur. The villagers watched, entranced, unable to look away. The show continued for hours, the puppets performing a variety of scenes, cheerful dances, tragic love stories, and eerie, unsettling acts that left the audience feeling a growing sense of unease. But no one dared to leave. It was as if the puppeteer had woven a spell over them, one that they couldn't escape, no matter how hard they tried. And then, at the climax of the performance, something changed. The last puppet to take the stage was different. It was smaller, its features more delicate, almost childlike. Its eyes, once bright and playful, now seemed to glisten with an unnatural gleam. As it moved, it appeared to be searching for something, its gaze scanning the crowd. The villagers, now fully enraptured by the show, felt a strange chill run through them. They couldn't understand it, but something felt wrong. The puppet paused for a moment, as if it had found what it was looking for, and then it stopped. The air around them grew thick with tension. The wind stilled. A single eerie note played from the tiny orchestra hidden behind the stage, sending shivers down the spine of every person present. The puppeteer, smiling with a cold, knowing grin, turned his gaze toward the crowd. "The performance has ended," he said in a voice that now seemed almost too smooth, too soft. "But the real show has only just begun." And with that, the puppet's gaze locked with that of a young boy in the front row, one who had come to the show with his parents, curious about the strange man and his puppets. The boy's heart raced as he felt an unexplainable pull, an invisible thread wrapping itself around him, binding him to the stage. But before he could even move, the show ended, and the crowd began to disperse, unaware of the true terror that had just been unleashed. No one noticed the puppet, now standing motionless on the stage, its eyes locked on the boy, its wooden hand twitching ever so slightly, as though it had been waiting for this moment. The village of Whispering Pines had unknowingly made its first step into the puppeteer's world. The next evening, when the village had settled into its familiar rhythm of quiet, the strange allure of the puppet theater returned. Word of the night's performance had already spread, and whispers danced on the wind like the fading echoes of a haunting melody. Curiosity clung to the air as more villagers, eager to see the puppets once more, found their way back to the show. The air had grown colder, but still they gathered, drawn by an invisible force that none could resist. It was as though the forest itself had grown darker, the towering trees whispering in tones too soft to understand. And yet, the villagers, those few brave enough to return, remained oblivious to the unsettling sense of danger that followed them. Even the children, who had once played near the village square, seemed drawn to the puppet theater. Their eyes sparkled with an unnatural excitement, as though they too were compelled to witness the magic that lay within the wooden puppets. The puppeteer appeared, as enigmatic as before, his cloak swirling around him like a shadow. His presence seemed to fill the air, pulling everyone closer, drawing them into his web. This time, however, his smile was wider, almost predatory. He knew that his audience had returned, hungry for the show, and with them, his power grew stronger. He beckoned the villagers to take their seats once more, but it wasn't the warmth of entertainment that awaited them. It was something far more insidious. The moment the puppet theater's curtains were drawn, the audience felt a shiver run through them. A haunting melody filled the air, the soft strains of a violin echoing through the square, so mournful and beautiful that it seemed to pull at the very heartstrings of those who listened. As the lights dimmed, the first puppet emerged, a tall, regal figure, its wooden face carved with intricate detail, and eyes that seemed to gleam with a lifelike gleam. But something was wrong. The puppet moved not with the jerky, artificial motions one would expect from a marionette, but with fluid grace, as though it were alive, its limbs bending in ways that defied logic. It danced across the stage, its movements perfectly timed to the music. But as it did, a subtle change occurred. The audience watched in rapt attention, oblivious to the fact that the puppet's every movement was being mirrored by someone else in the crowd. It was a child, sitting in the front row. She was no more than 8 years old, but as the puppet danced, so did she. Her body jerked and twisted in unnatural ways, her small limbs moving as though they were being controlled by invisible strings. Her eyes glazed over, her mouth parted in a silent, entranced smile. The villagers didn't notice. They couldn't. Their eyes were fixed solely on the performance before them, where more marionettes took the stage, each one more lifelike than the last. With each new puppet, another villager seemed to fall under its spell. A man in the back row began to twitch, his hands moving in tandem with the puppet's movements. A woman's legs jerked in perfect synchronization with the dancers on stage. Each puppet had a unique performance, a distinctive act, but with every moment, the magic grew darker, deeper. The villagers' limbs moved against their will, their bodies becoming more and more intertwined with the marionette's haunting choreography. The villagers' minds were clouded, their thoughts foggy and distant as their bodies became the puppet's stage. The pull of the strings, invisible to the eye, was inescapable. Some tried to stand, to break free, but their limbs refused to obey. It wasn't until one of the marionettes, small and delicate, stepped onto the stage that the horror of the truth began to reveal itself. This particular puppet moved in a way that was disturbingly human. It was not part of the show, but a strange new figure that had never been seen before. Its eyes were wide, filled with a gleam of recognition, and it walked with a subtle grace, as though it understood the tragedy unfolding around it. The puppet stopped in the center of the stage, and its eyes locked with the crowd. The moment the puppet looked into the eyes of the villagers, a sudden, painful jolt surged through their bodies. The marionette's movements became erratic, like 1,000 strings being pulled in different directions, and the villagers screamed, though no sound came out. Their bodies jerked uncontrollably as the strings tightened, pulling them towards the stage. The puppeteer stood motionless, watching his creations, his eyes gleaming with a dark satisfaction. The souls of the trapped villagers were now part of his collection, bound by invisible threads and forced to perform in a never-ending, twisted show. Their eyes, now dull and lifeless, stared into the abyss, their will completely surrendered to the marionette's macabre dance. In the stillness that followed, the puppet stood alone, its wooden form now a symbol of the village's lost hope. The villagers, their bodies frozen in place, would forever remain part of the enchanted performance, bound by strings that could never be severed. And as the curtain fell, the whispers of the forest grew louder, as if the very trees mourned the souls now trapped in the puppet's eternal dance. The village of Whispering Pines had always been a place where time seemed to stand still, but with each passing day, a shift was taking place, something dark and twisted, and it all began with the puppeteer's arrival. His puppet show had captivated the hearts of the villagers, but it wasn't just the performance that held them in thrall. It was the subtle, unspoken pull that he had over them. A pull that grew stronger with each show, drawing them deeper into his grasp. The puppeteer was no mere performer. There was something ancient about him, something primal that awakened deep within the villagers. It was as though he had always belonged to the village, as though his very presence had been fated, and none could escape the role they were now being forced to play. The moment they had set eyes on him, they had become part of the show, whether they realized it or not. For days, the puppeteer kept to his routine. He would appear at dusk, his silhouette rising from the fog as he made his way to the heart of the village. The streets would empty as the townsfolk gathered once again to witness his performance, drawn by a need they could not understand. It was as though their hearts beat in time with the music he played, their souls aligning with the rhythm of his show. But there was one thing the villagers didn't know. Each performance was more than just a show. Each night, the puppeteer was carefully selecting his next victims, those whose souls would become his newest marionettes. He wove a web of enchantment so subtle that no one even realized they were being ensnared. And as the show ended, he would slip away into the night, his power growing stronger with each passing hour. The lure was in the eyes of the puppets. When the show first began, the marionettes had appeared lifeless, their wooden faces frozen in expressions of joy, sadness, or terror. But now, as the villagers watched, they could see the faintest flicker of life in those painted eyes. It was as if the puppets were alive, staring right into the soul of the observer, as though they could see into their deepest fears and desires. And it wasn't just the puppets. The puppeteer himself had become a force of nature, a figure who seemed to exist outside of time, whose mere presence filled the air with an irresistible pull. The children were the first to fall under his spell. Their innocence, their untainted hearts, made them the perfect targets. They would sneak away from their homes at night, lured by the sound of music, their little feet carrying them to the puppet theater without their parents' knowledge. The villagers, unaware of their children's disappearance, carried on with their daily lives, oblivious to the growing darkness that surrounded them. The more they watched, the more entranced they became. The puppeteer knew exactly how to weave his magic, how to turn their emotions against them. Each puppet performance was more than just a show. It was a tool, a means of manipulation. The puppets, in their lifelike movements, seemed to call out to the audience, offering them something they could never have, an escape from the mundane, a glimpse into a world of magic, where anything was possible. The villagers were too enraptured to see the danger. The more they came, the more they became part of the show, their souls slipping further into the puppeteer's control. It wasn't long before the entire village was caught in the puppeteer's web, each person unknowingly bound by the strings of his craft. The whispers of the forest grew louder with each performance, urging them to stay, to give in to the enchantment, to accept the fate the puppeteer had in store for them. But among them, there were a few who began to notice something strange. The children who had attended the shows began to change. They grew quieter, their eyes dull, as if the life had been drained from them. They no longer smiled or laughed, and when they spoke, their voices were hollow, as though they were no longer truly alive. And then, there were those who had gone to the theater only once, those who came back changed, with their eyes glazed over, as if they were remembering something just beyond their reach. It was then that the villagers began to realize that something terrible was happening. The puppeteer's lure was not just an invitation to watch a show. It was an invitation to lose yourself, to become part of something darker, something that took far more than just your attention. It took your soul. And yet, no one dared to resist. No one dared to speak out. For to break free from the puppeteer's pull would mean facing the full wrath of his power. And deep down, the villagers knew that they had already become part of his collection. It was only a matter of time before they, too, would dance upon the stage, their wooden limbs jerking in time with the puppets, their souls trapped forever in a performance that could never end. The puppet show had become an inescapable part of life in Whispering Pines, drawing more and more villagers each night. What once started as a quaint diversion had now turned into a nightly ritual, a haunting necessity. There was no question of whether to attend. It was as if the entire village had been hypnotized by the puppeteer's performance. The people no longer came to watch out of curiosity, but out of something far more insidious, a compulsion they could neither understand nor resist. But as the days passed, strange things began to happen. The once cheerful chatter among the audience grew quieter, more distant, as if the villagers were growing increasingly withdrawn, consumed by the puppet shows. They attended the theater, sat in their seats with vacant expressions, and watched as the marionettes danced, lifelike and graceful, under the puppeteer's command. They were no longer mere spectators. They were becoming part of the performance, their presence woven into the dark magic that emanated from the stage. And then, one by one, they began to disappear. It started subtly at first. A few villagers, those who had been particularly entranced by the shows, were noticed missing the following morning. At first, no one thought much of it. People in Whispering Pines had always come and gone, and it was not unusual for someone to vanish without a trace. But as the days wore on, the disappearances grew more frequent, more alarming. Each night, more villagers would attend the show, and by morning, one or two of them would be gone, their homes empty, their lives seemingly erased. The villagers could not explain it. They asked each other where their missing friends and family members had gone, but no one could provide an answer. The only thing that remained the same was the puppeteer's performances, which continued with a haunting regularity, as though they had been fated to occur. As the disappearances grew more pronounced, a sense of unease settled over the village. At first, it was a vague feeling that something was wrong, a sensation that something dark was at work just beyond the veil of their understanding. But then, whispers began to spread, rumors that spoke of the true nature of the puppeteer and his twisted art. It was said that the night the puppets danced, they did not just perform for the audience. They sought something far more sinister, a soul to add to their collection, a soul to bind to the strings that controlled them. It was the only way the puppeteer could maintain his power, by feeding off the souls of the villagers, trapping them within his marionettes, and forcing them to perform as his puppets forevermore. The once vibrant village of Whispering Pines had become a hollow place, filled with a growing sense of dread. People spoke in hushed voices, avoiding the streets after dark, but the lure of the puppeteer's show was too strong, and so they came, night after night, unable to resist the call of the strings. And then came the night when it all changed. The audience gathered as usual, the anticipation thick in the air. The puppeteer, with his mysterious smile, beckoned them to take their seats, his eyes glinting with a dark satisfaction. The show began, and as the marionettes danced their eerie, mesmerizing routine, the villagers once again fell under the puppeteer's spell. But this time, something was different. As the performance reached its crescendo, the marionettes turned their gaze toward the audience, their eyes gleaming with something far more sinister. The people watched, transfixed, as the puppets' wooden faces twisted into expressions of malice. It was then that the audience realized the truth, that they were no longer the spectators. They were the ones being watched. With a sudden, chilling flicker of movement, the marionette's strings jerked violently, their limbs snapping with terrifying speed. The audience's eyes widened in horror as they felt an unnatural tug at their own bodies, as if invisible strings had wrapped around them, pulling them toward the stage. The villagers screamed, but no sound escaped their lips. Their bodies jerked and twisted, their movements no longer their own, as they were drawn toward the puppeteer's dark stage. The puppeteer stood motionless, watching his creations, his eyes gleaming with a dark satisfaction. The souls of the trapped villagers were now part of his collection, bound by invisible threads and forced to perform in a never-ending, twisted show. Their eyes, now dull and lifeless, stared into the abyss, their will completely surrendered to the marionette's macabre dance. In the stillness that followed, the puppet stood alone, its wooden form now a symbol of the village's lost hope. The villagers, their bodies frozen in place, would forever remain part of the enchanted performance, bound by strings that could never be severed. And as the curtain fell, the whispers of the forest grew louder, as if the very trees mourned the souls now trapped in the puppet's eternal dance. The village of Whispering Pines had always been a place where time seemed to stand still, but with each passing day, a shift was taking place, something dark and twisted, and it all began with the puppeteer's arrival. His puppet show had captivated the hearts of the villagers, but it wasn't just the performance that held them in thrall. It was the subtle, unspoken pull that he had over them. A pull that grew stronger with each show, drawing them deeper into his grasp. The puppeteer was no mere performer. There was something ancient about him, something primal that awakened deep within the villagers. It was as though he had always belonged to the village, as though his very presence had been fated, and none could escape the role they were now being forced to play. The moment they had set eyes on him, they had become part of the show, whether they realized it or not. For days, the puppeteer kept to his routine. He would appear at dusk, his silhouette rising from the fog as he made his way to the heart of the village. The streets would empty as the townsfolk gathered once again to witness his performance, drawn by a need they could not understand. It was as though their hearts beat in time with the music he played, their souls aligning with the rhythm of his show. But there was one thing the villagers didn't know. Each performance was more than just a show. Each night, the puppeteer was carefully selecting his next victims, those whose souls would become his newest marionettes. He wove a web of enchantment so subtle that no one even realized they were being ensnared. And as the show ended, he would slip away into the night, his power growing stronger with each passing hour. The lure was in the eyes of the puppets. When the show first began, the marionettes had appeared lifeless, their wooden faces frozen in expressions of joy, sadness, or terror. But now, as the villagers watched, they could see the faintest flicker of life in those painted eyes. It was as if the puppets were alive, staring right into the soul of the observer, as though they could see into their deepest fears and desires. And it wasn't just the puppets. The puppeteer himself had become a force of nature, a figure who seemed to exist outside of time, whose mere presence filled the air with an irresistible pull. The children were the first to fall under his spell. Their innocence, their untainted hearts, made them the perfect targets. They would sneak away from their homes at night, lured by the sound of music, their little feet carrying them to the puppet theater without their parents' knowledge. The villagers, unaware of their children's disappearance, carried on with their daily lives, oblivious to the growing darkness that surrounded them. The more they watched, the more entranced they became. The puppeteer knew exactly how to weave his magic, how to turn their emotions against them. Each puppet performance was more than just a show. It was a tool, a means of manipulation. The puppets, in their lifelike movements, seemed to call out to the audience, offering them something they could never have, an escape from the mundane, a glimpse into a world of magic where anything was possible. The villagers were too enraptured to see the danger. The more they came, the more they became part of the show, their souls slipping further into the puppeteer's control. It wasn't long before the entire village was caught in the puppeteer's web, each person unknowingly bound by the strings of his craft. The whispers of the forest grew louder with each performance, urging them to stay, to give in to the enchantment, to accept the fate the puppeteer had in store for them. But among them, there were a few who began to notice something strange. The children who had attended the shows began to change. They grew quieter, their eyes dull, as if the life had been drained from them. They no longer smiled or laughed, and when they spoke, their voices were hollow, as though they were no longer truly alive. And then there were those who had gone to the theater only once, those who came back changed, with their eyes glazed over, as if they were remembering something just beyond their reach. It was then that the villagers began to realize that something terrible was happening. The puppeteer's lure was not just an invitation to watch a show. It was an invitation to lose yourself, to become part of something darker, something that took far more than just your attention. It took your soul. And yet, no one dared to resist. No one dared to speak out. For to break free from the puppeteer's pull would mean facing the full wrath of his power, and deep down, the villagers knew that they had already become part of his collection. It was only a matter of time before they too would dance upon the stage, their wooden limbs jerking in time with the puppets, their souls trapped forever in a performance that could never end. The puppet show had become an inescapable part of life in Whispering Pines, drawing more and more villagers each night. What once started as a quaint diversion had now turned into a nightly ritual, a haunting necessity. There was no question of whether to attend. It was as if the entire village had been hypnotized by the puppeteer's performance. The people no longer came to watch out of curiosity, but out of something far more insidious, a compulsion they could neither understand nor resist. But as the days passed, strange things began to happen. The once cheerful chatter among the audience grew quieter, more distant, as if the villagers were growing increasingly withdrawn, consumed by the puppet shows. They attended the theater, sat in their seats with vacant expressions, and watched as the marionettes danced, lifelike and graceful, under the puppeteer's command. They were no longer mere spectators. They were becoming part of the performance, their presence woven into the dark magic that emanated from the stage. And then, one by one, they began to disappear. It started subtly at first. A few villagers, those who had been particularly entranced by the shows, were noticed missing the following morning. At first, no one thought much of it. People in Whispering Pines had always come and gone, and it was not unusual for someone to vanish without a trace. But as the days wore on, the disappearances grew more frequent, more alarming. Each night, more villagers would attend the show, and by morning, one or two of them would be gone, their homes empty, their lives seemingly erased. The villagers could not explain it. They asked each other where their missing friends and family members had gone, but no one could provide an answer. The only thing that remained the same was the puppeteer's performances, which continued with a haunting regularity, as though they had been fated to occur. As the disappearances grew more pronounced, a sense of unease settled over the village. At first, it was a vague feeling that something was wrong, a sensation that something dark was at work just beyond the veil of their understanding. But then, whispers began to spread, rumors that spoke of the true nature of the puppeteer and his twisted art. It was said that the night the puppets danced, they did not just perform for the audience. They sought something far more sinister, a soul to add to their collection, a soul to bind to the strings that controlled them. It was the only way the puppeteer could maintain his power, by feeding off the souls of the villagers, trapping them within his marionettes, and forcing them to perform as his puppets forevermore. The once vibrant village of Whispering Pines had become a hollow place, filled with a growing sense of dread. People spoke in hushed voices, avoiding the streets after dark, but the lure of the puppeteer's show was too strong. And so, they came, night after night, unable to resist the call of the strings. And then came the night when it all changed. The audience gathered as usual, the anticipation thick in the air. The puppeteer, with his mysterious smile, beckoned them to take their seats, his eyes glinting with a dark satisfaction. The show began, and as the marionettes danced their eerie, mesmerizing routine, the villagers once again fell under the puppeteer's spell. But this time, something was different. As the performance reached its crescendo, the marionettes turned their gaze toward the audience, their eyes gleaming with something far more sinister. The people watched, transfixed, as the puppets' wooden faces twisted into expressions of malice. It was then that the audience realized the truth, that they were no longer the spectators. They were the ones being watched. With a sudden, chilling flicker of movement, the marionette strings jerked violently, their limbs snapping with terrifying speed. The audience's eyes widened in horror as they felt an unnatural tug at their own bodies, as if invisible strings had wrapped around them, pulling them toward the stage. The villagers screamed, but no sound escaped their lips. Their bodies jerked and twisted, their movements no longer their own, as they were drawn toward the puppeteer's dark stage. One by one they vanished from the crowd, their forms dissipating into the shadows, swallowed by the void. The remaining villagers watched in helpless horror as their friends and families were pulled from reality, their bodies now part of the puppeteer's cursed show. By morning, the village was silent. The streets were eerily empty, the once bustling market square now deserted. No one knew where the villagers had gone, but one thing was certain: the puppeteer had claimed them, and with them, their souls. The puppeteer's show continued, but it had changed. The marionettes now danced in eerie unison, their movements no longer just part of the performance, but an extension of the villagers' own souls, trapped forever in the puppets' twisted, lifeless bodies. The puppeteer smiled to himself as he watched his collection grow, his power stronger than ever. And somewhere, In the depths of the village, the whispers began again, warning those who dared listen. If you attend the puppeteer's show, you will never leave. You will be lost, consumed by the strings that bind you to his eternal performance. Whispering Pines had become a place of silence, a village that had once been filled with laughter and life, now reduced to an eerie quiet, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. The air itself seemed to carry a heavy weight, a suffocating presence that left a chill in the bones of anyone who dared enter. The puppeteer's influence was pervasive, creeping into every corner of the village, his presence lurking just beneath the surface of daily life. But the worst part was not the strange stillness or the missing villagers. It was the curse of the strings. It was said that those who attended the puppet shows and disappeared were not truly gone. Their souls had been trapped by the puppeteer, bound to the strings of his marionettes, where they would remain forevermore, forced to perform for him in an endless, agonizing dance. But this curse was not limited to the victims alone. It stretched far beyond the marionettes, far beyond the performers, and it was rooted deep in the very fabric of the village itself. The villagers began to feel its effects long before they fully understood the nature of the curse. At first, it was just a subtle shift, an inexplicable feeling of being watched, of being pulled in a direction they could not control. They felt the strings tightening around their lives, invisible threads that seemed to tug at them when they weren't looking, drawing them toward the theater, toward the puppeteer. Each day, it became harder to ignore the pull, the insistent lure of the performance, as though the strings of fate were slowly wrapping themselves around the hearts of everyone in the village. But the strings did not only control the villagers' movements, they were far more insidious than that. The curse began to erode their very sense of self, slowly unraveling their identities, twisting them into something unrecognizable. People who had once been full of life, with dreams and desires of their own, began to fade. They spoke in monotones, their eyes glazed over, their conversations lacking meaning or emotion. They no longer seemed to be the same people they had once been. It was as if the puppeteer had taken hold of their very souls, threading them onto his invisible strings and pulling them toward a future that no longer belonged to them. And yet, no one could break free. The pull was too strong. The more they tried to resist, the tighter the strings became. Even the bravest of souls, those who sought to defy the puppeteer's control, found themselves unable to escape the suffocating web he had woven around them. The villagers had no choice but to live in the shadow of the puppeteer, their lives now a twisted reflection of what they once were, nothing more than marionettes controlled by the unseen strings of fate. The truth was more horrifying than any of them could have imagined. The puppeteer did not just collect souls for his own gain. He fed on them, drawing strength from the despair and helplessness of those he trapped. Every time someone was pulled into his collection, their soul was bound to the strings, becoming an instrument of his dark will. They were no longer themselves, but a mere extension of his power, performing for him in a dance of torment that could never end. As the curse spread, the village itself seemed to warp, the very land becoming infected by the puppeteer's dark magic. The trees no longer whispered in the wind. Instead, they groaned, as if burdened by the weight of the souls that had been stolen. The once vibrant forests surrounding Whispering Pines had grown twisted and barren, the leaves blackened and withered, as though they too were caught in the puppeteer's grip. The sky above the village had turned a perpetual shade of gray, blocking out the sunlight, leaving only a cold, oppressive gloom. Those who dared venture near the puppet theater would hear the soft, mournful music playing from within, a melody that seemed to seep into the very fabric of the air. The sound of strings being pulled, the faintest squeak of wood on wood, could be heard even from a distance, a constant reminder that the puppeteer was always watching, always waiting for his next victim to wander into his trap. The curse of the strings had become a living nightmare, and no one was safe. It was only a matter of time before the remaining villagers would find themselves drawn into the puppeteer's web, their souls claimed by the invisible threads that now controlled their lives. The once peaceful village had become a prison, a place where the strings of fate twisted and turned with every step, pulling everyone ever closer to the puppeteer's dark performance. But even in the darkest of times, there were those who refused to surrender to the curse. Among the villagers, a small group had begun to seek answers, to uncover the truth behind the puppeteer's dark power. They knew that they had to act quickly, or they too would become just another part of the puppeteer's cursed collection. They had to find a way to break the strings, to shatter the puppet master's hold on their village before it was too late. In the midst of the growing darkness that consumed Whispering Pines, two siblings stood apart from the fearful masses. While others were bound by the puppeteer's strings, the siblings, Leona and Cassian, remained determined to uncover the truth behind the eerie puppet shows and the mysterious disappearances. Their bond was unbreakable, and they were prepared to face whatever horrors awaited them, no matter how terrifying or dangerous. Leona, the older of the two, had always been known for her strength and courage. Her dark eyes held a quiet determination, a fierceness that had served her well when the world around her seemed to crumble. She had seen the gradual shift in the village, the growing silence that accompanied the strange performances, and the increasing number of missing townsfolk. But what troubled her most was the way the villagers had changed. They no longer laughed, no longer engaged in meaningful conversations. It was as though their souls had been drained, leaving behind only hollow shells of who they once were. Cassian, her younger brother, was not as strong as Leona in stature, but his intellect and curiosity were unmatched. He had always been fascinated by the stories of magic and mystery that filled the village's folklore. However, his fascination had taken a darker turn when he began to notice that the puppet shows seemed to drain something far more valuable than just the villagers' attention. They took their very essence. The disappearance of friends and family members had left Cassian haunted, his mind constantly racing for an explanation. The eerie feeling in the air, the growing dread in his heart, it all pointed to the puppeteer and the sinister force that he commanded. Together, they were an unlikely but perfect pair, a combination of courage, wit, and unshakable resolve. One night, as the rest of the village succumbed to the puppeteer's spell and attended another show, Leona and Cassian decided to act. They could no longer sit idly by while their people were slowly consumed by the curse. The siblings had heard the rumors, whispers of the puppeteer's power, of the souls trapped within his marionettes. It was said that those who dared to defy him would face unimaginable consequences, but Leona and Cassian were not afraid. The time had come to confront the evil that had taken root in their village, to end the puppeteer's reign of terror. With the moon casting a faint light over the village, the siblings made their way toward the theater, determined to discover the truth behind the puppet master's dark magic. The streets were eerily quiet, the soft sound of their footsteps the only noise in the air. As they approached the puppet theater, a chill ran down their spines. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar, as though inviting them in. The haunting music that had played through the nights now seemed louder, more pressing, as if calling to them. It was clear that the puppeteer was preparing for another performance. Leona gripped her brother's hand tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what awaited them inside, but she knew that they had no choice. If they didn't act now, the village would be lost forever. They had to find a way to break the curse, to save the souls that had been bound to the strings, and to destroy the puppeteer's dark power once and for all. Inside the theater, the air was thick with an unsettling sense of anticipation. The stage was dimly lit, the marionettes hanging motionless in the shadows, their wooden eyes gleaming with malice. At the far end of the room, standing in front of a massive, ornate mirror, was the puppeteer himself. His figure was shrouded in darkness, his movements fluid and unnatural, as if he were one with the very strings he controlled. Leona and Cassian exchanged a brief, determined glance before stepping forward into the heart of the theater. The air seemed to grow heavier with each step, the pull of the strings more palpable, as if the puppeteer's dark magic was wrapping around them. The siblings could feel their hearts beat faster, their breaths growing shallow as they approached the stage. "We've come for you," Leona said, her voice steady but filled with resolve. The puppeteer turned slowly, his cold, empty eyes locking onto theirs. A smile spread across his face, twisted and unsettling as he stepped forward, his movements deliberate and deliberate. He had been expecting them. "You should have stayed away," he said, his voice smooth, almost hypnotic. "But now that you've come, there's no going back. You'll join my collection soon enough." Leona and Cassian stood their ground, refusing to be intimidated by the puppeteer's words. They had come too far to turn back now. Together, they would face whatever horrors awaited them in the heart of the puppet theater. They were ready to fight for their village, ready to break the curse that had plagued Whispering Pines for far too long. As Leona and Cassian stood before the puppeteer, a sense of foreboding filled the room. The marionettes, lifeless and cold just moments ago, now seemed to stir, their wooden eyes gleaming in the dim light. They hovered in the background, waiting, as if tethered to the very strings that bound the puppeteer's dark power. But it was not just the marionettes that were animated. The air itself seemed alive with a malevolent energy, an unseen force that sought to ensnare them. The puppeteer's grin widened as he circled them slowly, his movements deliberate and unnerving. He spoke again, his voice low and melodic, each word dripping with the weight of ancient knowledge. "You think you can undo what has been done, break the curse I've woven? The strings are already in place. My power has already claimed the village." Leona stood firm, her eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about? You've taken everything from us. We won't let you keep doing this." The puppeteer stopped before them, his gaze piercing. He seemed almost amused, as though he was watching a puppet who had finally realized it was being controlled. "Ah, yes, the curse. But you don't understand. This isn't just some random curse. It's the result of a pact, a dark bargain made long ago." Cassian's mind raced. He had suspected something darker, something far more sinister behind the puppeteer's abilities. But hearing the puppeteer speak so plainly of a pact only confirmed his worst fears. The puppeteer continued, his voice now tinged with a hint of pride. "Long ago, I was a man of ambition, much like you. I sought power, sought control over the forces of life and death. My name was once known in distant lands before the pact. I sought immortality, a way to live beyond the reach of time, to transcend the limitations of the mortal world. But immortality is not given freely. It must be earned, and what I had to give in exchange was far greater than I ever imagined." Leona's heart skipped a beat. "What did you give?" The puppeteer's smile grew darker, his eyes flickering with an ancient, predatory gleam. "My soul." The words hung heavy in the air, a cold confession that echoed through the theater like a death knell. Leona and Cassian recoiled, realizing that the man before them was no longer truly human. His pact with the forces beyond the mortal realm had stripped him of his very soul, turning him into something far worse, something that fed on the souls of others. "In exchange for eternal life, I gave my soul," he continued, his voice becoming almost wistful. "But immortality came with a price. My soul was bound to the strings of fate, twisted and twisted until it was no longer my own. And in my hunger for power, I forged the puppets, creations of wood and string, infused with the souls of those I had taken. They are my instruments, my servants, and through them, I control the lives of those around me." Cassian's hands clenched into fists, his heart pounding with rage. The realization was horrifying. The puppeteer was not just a villain. He was a victim of his own greed, a man who had given up everything for the illusion of power and control. But in doing so, he had condemned not only himself, but countless others. "The souls of the lost, those who vanish after each show, they are mine," the puppeteer said, almost tenderly. "I feed off their despair, their fear, and in return they perform for me. Their souls are trapped in my marionettes, bound to the strings that I control. They dance for me, trapped in an endless cycle of torment, unable to escape." Leona's voice was low but steady. "We won't let you do this anymore." The puppeteer's smile faltered for just a moment, and his eyes flashed with something dangerous. "You think you can defeat me? You think you can break the pact? The deal I made is far older than you, far more powerful. It is woven into the very fabric of reality itself. You cannot undo what has already been done. But Cassian, ever the strategist, stepped forward. You're wrong. We may not be able to undo the pact, but we can sever your connection to it. You are not invincible, not truly. The pact may have given you power, but it also bound you to a master, one that doesn't care for you, only for your soul. The puppeteer's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing with a glint of malice. You do not understand. You are nothing but puppets, trying to defy the inevitable. I am the master here. Leona and Cassian exchanged a glance, their resolve hardening. They knew they were up against something far older and darker than they had imagined. The puppeteer had made his pact with forces that were not of this world, and breaking it would require more than just courage. It would require a sacrifice, a willingness to face the very darkness that had consumed their village. We will find a way, Leona said, her voice unwavering. You're not as powerful as you think. The puppeteer's smile turned into a cold sneer. Then come and try, but know this, once you enter the heart of the curse, there is no turning back. With that, the puppeteer raised his hands, and the marionettes around them came to life, their wooden limbs creaking as they took their first steps toward the siblings. The battle for Whispering Pines was about to begin in earnest. After the puppeteer's dark revelation, Leona and Cassian knew their path was clear. If they were to have any hope of breaking the curse, they needed to understand the source of his power. The puppeteer's pact with dark forces had granted him unimaginable control over the souls he captured, but his power wasn't unlimited. It was rooted in something far more tangible, something that could be destroyed. The key lay within his workshop, a place the villagers had heard of in whispers but were too terrified to enter. No one truly knew what lay beyond the ironclad doors of the puppeteer's lair, but it was said to be a place of nightmares, a workshop where souls were twisted into marionettes, where life and death merged in horrific ways. Under the cover of darkness, the siblings ventured towards the heart of the puppeteer's domain, their footsteps light but purposeful. The journey to the workshop took them deep into the woods, far from the village's safety, where the trees seemed to close in around them. The dense fog clung to their skin, and the distant, eerie music of the puppet shows floated in the air, carried by the wind. The deeper they ventured, the more the forest seemed to shift and change. The air grew heavier with each step, thick with the scent of decay and something else, something far more unnatural. It wasn't long before they came upon a clearing, and there, looming in the darkness, stood the workshop. The structure was a twisted version of a normal building, its stone walls cracked and jagged, the windows dark and vacant, as if they had never seen light. The roof was crowned with strange symbols, etched deep into the stone, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. An unsettling hum emanated from within, like the distant echo of 1,000 voices crying out in agony. Leona stood before the entrance, her heart pounding in her chest. It was here that the puppeteer's power had taken root, here that the souls of the lost were bound to the strings of his marionettes. But it was also the place where their journey would end, one way or another. They could feel it in the air. This was no ordinary workshop. This was the heart of the curse. With a glance at Cassian, Leona pushed open the creaking door, its rusted hinges groaning in protest. The door revealed a large, dimly lit room, filled with strange contraptions and eerie shadows. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with puppets, puppets of all shapes and sizes. Some were beautifully crafted, their faces frozen in grotesque smiles, while others were far more disturbing. Marionettes twisted and malformed, their wooden limbs contorted in unnatural ways. Cassian's eyes widened as he took in the scene. These are the souls, aren't they? Leona nodded grimly. They are the ones who disappeared. The puppeteer has trapped their souls inside these wooden shells. He controls them, uses them for his own twisted purposes. At the far end of the room stood the puppeteer's throne, a grotesque creation fashioned from the bones of previous victims, its armrests twisted into the shape of skulls. And in front of it, standing in the center of the room, was a massive mirror, tall and distorted, its edges lined with silver chains, each one shimmering with an ethereal glow. Cassian's voice trembled as he spoke. "That's it, isn't it? The mirror. That's what he uses to control the souls." Leona's gaze locked onto the mirror, a sense of dread flooding her chest. She could feel it now, the pull of the mirror's dark power. It was not just a reflection, it was a window into the very fabric of the curse. Through it, the puppeteer could see everything, control everything. It was the source of his magic, his connection to the dark forces that had granted him his power. Suddenly the air grew colder, and a voice echoed through the workshop, smooth and insidious. "So, you found my workshop, have you? How brave, or perhaps foolish." The puppeteer appeared in the doorway, his form stepping out of the shadows like a phantom, his face cold and impassive. He regarded Leona and Cassian with an almost amused expression. "You think you can stop me? That this place holds the key to your salvation? You are mistaken. The strings are already in place. You are too late." Leona's grip on her sword tightened. "We haven't come to save ourselves. We've come to stop you." The puppeteer chuckled softly. "And how do you intend to do that? You've seen my creations. You've seen the machines I've built. Every puppet, every marionette is a part of me now. You cannot break the strings that bind them, not without destroying everything." Cassian's mind raced. He knew they couldn't defeat the puppeteer by force alone. They needed something more, something that could sever the connection between the puppeteer and his dark pact. But what? As the puppeteer approached, his fingers outstretched like the strings of a marionette, Leona stepped forward, her voice firm. "We'll find a way. You may have created this workshop, but it will be your undoing." The puppeteer's smile faded, replaced by an expression of pure malice. "Then let's see if you can survive long enough to see it through." The air in the puppeteer's workshop was thick with tension, every corner shadowed by the twisted forms of his creations. The ominous hum of his dark machines reverberated through the walls, setting the stage for the confrontation that had been building for so long. Leona and Cassian stood firm, their eyes locked on the puppeteer, whose smile had disappeared entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating gaze. "You've come to challenge me, then?" The puppeteer's voice was soft, but it carried a menacing edge. "You think you can stop the inevitable? That you can sever the strings that bind me to my creations?" Leona's fingers tightened around the hilt of her sword, her resolve unshaken. "You've taken everything from this village. You've taken souls, twisted lives. You don't have the right to control them anymore." The puppeteer's laughter echoed through the room, hollow and cruel. "You misunderstand, child. I don't control them. I give them purpose. The souls I take, they serve me, and they serve a greater purpose than you can ever imagine." Cassian stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with fury. "Your creations are not servants, they're prisoners. You're a monster. And your pact with the dark forces, your obsession with immortality, has cost more lives than you can count." The puppeteer's eyes darkened, and in that moment, something in his demeanor shifted. His hands rose slowly, and the marionettes around them seemed to stir, their wooden limbs creaking as they began to move. The strings that bound them shimmered in the dim light, and the puppeteer's control over them was unmistakable. "You speak of prisoners," the puppeteer mused, "but it is you who are the prisoners. Prisoners of fate, prisoners of time. You cannot win against me. The strings have already been pulled, and the show is nearly over." Leona's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood tall, unwilling to back down. "We don't need to win. We just need to break your control." The puppeteer's eyes flashed with dark amusement. "Then you will have to face the consequences of your defiance." With a flick of his wrist, the strings of the marionettes tightened, and the puppets sprang into action. Their movements were swift and deadly, their wooden bodies unnaturally flexible, as if they had been trained for this moment. One by one, the puppets advanced toward Leona and Cassian, their eyes fixed on them like cold, soulless sentinels. Cassian lunged forward, his blade meeting the wood of one of the marionettes with a sharp crack. The puppet staggered back, but only for a moment before it moved again, its joints snapping back into place with disturbing precision. Leona fought beside him, her sword flashing in the dim light as she clashed with another marionette. But the more they fought, the more it became clear. The marionettes weren't just fighting them, they were testing them. The puppeteer watched them with a cold, detached gaze, as if observing a well-rehearsed performance. "You're weak," he said. "You have no understanding of what you're truly up against. These souls, these puppets, they are more than just tools. They are extensions of my will. You can strike them down, but they will always rise again." Leona's sword clanged against the marionette's wooden body, and for a brief moment she caught sight of the strings that connected it to the puppeteer. They were more than mere threads. They pulsed with a dark, living energy, binding the marionette to its master. It was then that she understood. These puppets weren't simply controlled. They were tethered to the puppeteer's soul, and every strike she made against them only made them stronger. Cassian, his face grim with realization, shouted over the din of battle, "We can't defeat them like this. We need to cut the strings." Leona nodded. She had to break the puppeteer's control over them. She turned her gaze to the massive mirror at the far end of the room, its surface shimmering with dark power. The mirror was the key. It was through the mirror that the puppeteer's power flowed, through which he controlled the strings of his marionettes. If they could shatter the mirror, they could sever the puppeteer's connection to the souls he had trapped. But as if reading her thoughts, the puppeteer raised his hands, his fingers twitching, and the strings around them tightened. The marionettes froze in place, and the room fell silent, save for the eerie hum of the machines. The puppeteer's voice rang out, more commanding than before. "You think you can break my power? You think you can stop the show? This is my domain, and I am the master of these strings." With a snap of his fingers, the strings attached to the marionettes pulled taut, and the puppets moved with terrifying speed. They surrounded Leona and Cassian, their limbs swinging like weapons, their eyes empty and unfeeling. The siblings were now trapped in a deadly dance, their every move dictated by the strings that the puppeteer controlled. But Leona's resolve remained unwavering. She couldn't let fear dictate her actions. She knew what had to be done. With a quick glance at Cassian, she shouted, "We need to reach the mirror. It's the only way to break his control." Cassian nodded, his expression steely. Together they fought their way through the marionettes, dodging strikes and cutting through the strings that connected the puppets to their master. The room seemed to spin as they neared the mirror, the marionettes closing in on them with each passing second. Leona reached the mirror first, her hand outstretched, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could feel the pulsing energy of the strings, the power of the puppeteer's control emanating from the mirror itself. She didn't hesitate. With one swift motion, she drove her sword into the mirror's surface, shattering it with a deafening crack. For a moment, everything went still. Then, the strings snapped. The marionettes staggered, their wooden limbs jerking wildly as the magic that had bound them unraveled. The puppeteer's cry of rage echoed through the workshop as his control over the souls was severed, the dark energy that had fueled his power dissipating into the air like smoke. The room was still, the air heavy with the remnants of shattered magic. The mirror lay in pieces on the floor, its dark glow now extinguished. The marionettes, once lifeless and bound by invisible strings, collapsed in a heap, their wooden bodies now devoid of purpose. The power that had once controlled them, that had twisted them into instruments of the puppeteer's will, was gone. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the workshop was silent, save for the soft crackle of broken wood. Leona stood over the wreckage, her sword still gripped tightly in her hand, her chest heaving with exertion. She glanced at Cassian, who was breathing heavily beside her, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and relief. They had done it. They had broken the mirror, severing the puppeteer's hold on the souls he had trapped. But the victory felt hollow. The puppeteer was still here, his power no longer bound by the strings, but his presence was as suffocating as ever. The puppeteer stood across the room, his expression dark and furious. The color had drained from his face, and his hands were trembling, the last vestiges of his control slipping through his fingers like sand. His voice was a low, guttural growl. "You think you've won? That destroying the mirror will free the souls you've fought so hard to save?" Leona's voice was firm, unwavering. "We've broken your control. The souls are free." For a moment, the puppeteer said nothing. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he raised his arms high, the air around him crackling with energy. "You may have destroyed my mirror, but I am no mere puppet, child. I am the master of this domain. I am the one who holds the strings. And I will not be undone by a pair of fools." The ground beneath them trembled, and Leona could feel the dark energy gathering in the room, swirling like a storm. The puppeteer's magic was far from gone. It had simply shifted, taking on a new, more dangerous form. The curse he had placed on the village, on the souls he had captured, was not something that could be broken with a single strike. Cassian's eyes widened as the shadows in the room began to stir. The marionettes, lifeless just moments before, were beginning to move again, their wooden limbs jerking as if controlled by unseen hands. But this time, there was something different about them. They were no longer the puppets of the past, bound to the will of the puppeteer. Now, they seemed to be alive with their own intent, their eyes glimmering with the faintest trace of freedom. "The curse," Cassian whispered, his voice thick with realization. "It's not just about the puppets. It's the souls. He's bound them to this place, to this workshop." Leona's heart sank. She had thought that destroying the mirror would be enough, that the curse would be broken with the severing of the strings. But the puppeteer had tied the souls to this place in a far deeper way. The marionettes might be free of his control, but the curse still lingered, woven into the very fabric of the workshop. "We need to destroy the source," Leona said, her voice steady. "The pact, the magic that binds this place together." The puppeteer's eyes flicked toward them, a dangerous gleam in his gaze. "You cannot destroy what has already been made. You cannot break what is already bound." Leona and Cassian exchanged a glance, understanding passing between them. They knew what they had to do. The puppeteer's pact with the dark forces was the root of his power, the source of the curse. It wasn't enough to just break the mirror. It wasn't enough to sever the strings. They needed to destroy the very foundation of his magic, the pact that had given him control over the souls of the lost. Leona turned to face the puppeteer, her grip on her sword tightening. "You made a deal with forces darker than you can control. Now, it's time to pay the price." With a swift motion, she raised her sword, its blade gleaming in the dim light. "The pact ends here." The puppeteer's expression twisted into a snarl. "Fools! You have no idea what you're dealing with." But it was too late. Leona's sword struck the ground with a resounding thud, and the room was filled with a blinding light. The energy in the workshop surged, crackling like a storm, as the ancient magic that bound the puppeteer to the dark forces began to unravel. The walls shook, the floor trembled beneath their feet, and the marionettes, once again freed from the puppeteer's control, watched silently as the curse began to break. The puppeteer screamed in agony as the magic that had sustained him for so long began to fade. The dark energy that had bound him to the workshop and to the souls he had claimed was unraveling, dissipating like smoke in the wind. His body trembled, his eyes wild with desperation as he tried to hold on to the power that had given him immortality. But it was no use. The strings were severed, the pact was broken. And with a final guttural cry, the puppeteer fell to his knees. His form began to twist and distort, as if his very essence was being pulled apart. The shadows that had clung to him for so long vanished, leaving behind nothing but the hollow shell of the monster he had once been. Leona and Cassian stood in silence as the last remnants of the puppeteer's power faded into nothingness. The workshop, once filled with the echoes of dark magic, was now quiet. The souls he had trapped were free, their spirits no longer bound by his cursed strings. But as the dawn broke over the horizon, a lingering sense of unease hung in the air. The curse had been broken, but the legacy of the puppeteer would remain, a warning to those who dared to dabble in forces beyond their control. The last remnants of the puppeteer's power dissolved into the air, leaving behind a quiet that felt more oppressive than peaceful. Leona and Cassian stood at the heart of the workshop, their swords lowered, their breath heavy from the battle. The once majestic theater was now a husk of its former self, its dark energy extinguished, the cursed marionettes lifeless and scattered in pieces across the floor. But as the weight of the silence sank in, it became clear that the victory had not come without a price. The puppeteer, once a towering figure of power and dread, was now a broken man, his twisted body crumpled in the center of the room. His face, once filled with arrogant malice, was now an expression of sheer terror. Leona stepped closer, her eyes narrowing at the fallen figure. The man who had once controlled so many lives, who had bound the souls of the innocent to his will, was now nothing more than a shadow of his former self. The puppeteer's eyes fluttered open, and he let out a ragged breath. His voice, hoarse and barely a whisper, echoed through the room. You think you've won. You think you've destroyed me." Leona crouched down, her gaze steady and unwavering. "It's over. Your reign of terror ends today." The puppeteer's eyes flickered with a hint of defiance, but there was something else in them now. Fear. For the first time, he seemed to understand the true weight of his actions, the cost of his obsession with immortality and control. He had sold his soul, and in the end, it was his downfall. "You don't understand," the puppeteer rasped, his voice trembling. "I didn't do this for power. I did it for something greater. I wanted to preserve the art, the beauty of the performance. I wanted to create something eternal." Leona's heart hardened at his words. "You sacrificed lives, twisted souls, and stole the essence of countless people. For art?" Her voice was cold, cutting through the puppeteer's words like a knife. "Your obsession destroyed everything it touched." The puppeteer's face twisted into a bitter grimace. "You don't get it, do you? Art is eternal, and I was going to make it perfect. I gave them purpose. I gave them meaning." "But they didn't want your meaning," Cassian interjected, his voice filled with disgust. "They were forced into it. They didn't have a choice." The puppeteer's lips curled into a smile, one that was far from comforting. "Perhaps. But now you've broken the strings, shattered my mirror. You've freed them. But at what cost? The curse has been lifted, yes. But the souls I've taken, they can never return. And you will never escape what you've done." His words hung in the air like a dark omen, but Leona refused to let them take root. She stood tall, her gaze unflinching as she stared at the broken figure before her. "The souls are free," she said firmly. "That's all that matters. You've paid for your actions, and now your time is over." The puppeteer's smile faded, his expression becoming one of resignation. The fight had left him, and with it, any hope of redemption. His body, once filled with dark energy, was now fading, as though the very life force that had sustained him was being drained away. With one final breath, the puppeteer's body crumbled into dust, his form dissipating like a forgotten memory. The shadows that had clung to him vanished, leaving behind only silence and the remnants of his cursed creations. Leona and Cassian stood in the quiet aftermath, the weight of their victory settling over them. The workshop, once a place of darkness and fear, was now a hollow, empty shell. The souls that had been trapped for so long were free, their spirits drifting into the light of dawn. But even as the sun rose, casting a warm glow over the village, Leona couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease. The puppeteer was gone, but his legacy remained, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition, of the cost of playing with forces beyond one's control. Cassian, sensing her unease, placed a hand on her shoulder. "We've done what we came to do. The village is free." Leona nodded, though her mind was far from at peace. She knew that the scars left by the puppeteer's reign would never truly heal. The villagers would remember, and the whispers of the puppeteer's dark magic would echo through the generations. "The curse may be broken," Leona said softly, "but the story of the puppeteer of souls will never be forgotten." And with that, they left the workshop, stepping into the light of a new day, knowing that though the battle had been won, the shadows of the past would always linger. The village of Whispering Pines was quiet once more, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It wasn't the suffocating silence of fear that had once permeated every corner, nor was it the eerie stillness that had accompanied the puppeteer's performances. Now, it was a stillness that carried a heavy weight, as though the earth itself had sighed in relief. The sun rose over the horizon, casting golden light across the village, but the shadows of the past lingered in the corners of every home, every street, every heart. Leona and Cassian stood at the edge of the village, looking back toward the workshop, the place where it had all started. The puppeteer's curse had been broken, and the souls he had stolen were free, but the scars of his twisted artistry remained. The marionettes, though lifeless and discarded, still held a disturbing presence, as though their eyes followed them, watching from the shadows. The wind seemed to carry whispers, faint voices, distant and hollow, like a memory that refused to fade. "They'll never forget," Cassian said quietly, his gaze distant as he surveyed the village. "What he did, what he turned them into." Leona nodded. "No, they won't. The puppeteer's legacy is carved into this place now. The memories of the lost souls will never fade completely." Even after the defeat of the puppeteer, his influence had left an indelible mark on the land. The villagers who had once been oblivious to the dark magic at work now carried an unspoken understanding, a shared history that bound them together. They had all been touched by the puppeteer's curse, whether they had been aware of it or not. They had all watched, knowingly or unknowingly, as lives were taken and souls were twisted. The fear that had once gripped them was gone, but in its place was something more lingering, a quiet sorrow, a shadow that would never completely lift. As they walked through the village, Leona couldn't help but notice the way the townsfolk glanced at her, their eyes filled with gratitude, but also with something else. It wasn't just the relief of being free from the puppeteer's dark influence. It was the weight of knowing that the peace they now had come at a cost. The sacrifice, the battle, the horror of it all would never truly leave them. But there was another truth, one that hung in the air like an unspoken promise. The village had survived. They had faced the darkness, and they had emerged stronger, even if the scars would never fade. At the village square, Leona paused, her eyes falling on a small statue that had been erected in honor of those lost during the puppeteer's reign. It was simple, almost childlike in its design, but it captured the essence of the souls who had been stolen, their faces etched in stone, their forms frozen in an eternal dance. A reminder that while the puppeteer's reign was over, the cost of his ambition had been paid in lives, in souls. Cassian joined her, his gaze softening as he looked at the statue. "They'll remember," he said quietly. Leona nodded. "They will, but the story of the puppeteer of souls doesn't end here. The curse is gone, but his legacy will live on in the hearts of those who survived. The souls he claimed may be free, but the lessons they left behind, of power, of greed, of the price of art, will echo through the generations." The wind picked up again, rustling the trees, carrying with it the faintest hint of the puppeteer's haunting melody. It was a sound that would never fully disappear, no matter how far they ran or how deep they buried their memories. The puppeteer's strings may have been severed, but the echoes of his twisted symphony would always remain, haunting the village like a shadow that could never be cast away. And as Leona and Cassian turned to leave the village behind, they knew that the true price of breaking the curse wasn't just the lives lost in the puppeteer's name. It was the legacy that would linger, the knowledge that even in freedom, the past could never truly be escaped. The village would go on, the souls would heal, but the shadow of the puppeteer of souls would forever hang over Whispering Pines. For some stories, it was said, never truly ended, They simply became a part of the land, of the people, of the places they had touched, haunting them for as long as the wind continued to blow.